Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. It is absolutely a pleasure for me to introduce our special guest today, Megan McQuary. Megan is a certified EMDR clinician and trainer, as well as a certified clinical trauma professional through Evergreen certifications and an advanced certified alcohol and drug counselor. Megan has been extensively trained on the use of EMDR as a treatment protocol and uses EMDR in her practice to achieve improved outcomes with a broad spectrum of clients in the areas of trauma, abuse, attachment, and substance abuse. She is an expert witness at the state and federal level for her expertise in areas surrounding trauma, and her trainings helped thousands of clinicians nationally and internationally get the most out of EMDR, trauma, and addiction-based skills and practices. And I'm one of the lucky individuals that got to attend one of Megan's excellent introductory two-day training programs on EMDR. And Megan, I am so deeply thrilled and grateful that you are here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really look forward to this time together and getting to share our knowledge and wisdom with your audience.
Thank you. So
Yeah.
I would love it if you're open to sharing just a little bit about your story. Like, how did you get into this particular type of pretty amazing work that you do?
Yeah, so obviously it's a journey. Like I'm sure everyone's path is a journey that we find, right? And so mine, I kind of grew up in a background with a lot of abuse and trauma as a kiddo. And one of the ways that I had essentially learned to cope through that was through, I was a big high performance athlete. So I ended up getting a scholarship in track and cross country. And I had learned about how to like cope through things with my mentality, and being a college athlete and just very passionate about performing and about succeeding and always having goals to work for. And it was kind of the way that I avoided all of the junk in my life. And initially, I thought I was going to be a physical therapist. That's what I wanted to do, was work with college athletes. And one of the barriers that I kind of continued to find with myself as I was a college athlete was a lot of these mental blocks that I couldn't get over. And so I ended up changing my degree after the first couple of years of college into social work and mental health stuff. And so I did psychology, and then I got into social work. And about 7 years ago, I opened and started from ground zero my own intensive outpatient clinic for substance abuse, and was really passionate about making a difference for the way that people deal with their thoughts, whatever our goals are that kept, or, and what's keeping us from those goals, what's getting in the way of being who we want to be in life, as this was a barrier that I had seen, not just from athletics, but from other goals that I've set in my life. And I wanted to do that differently and be real and authentic and unique in the way that I treated those things. So I was able to start that, and it was rough, as it is for most new business owners, right? So I had a lot of learning and growing that I did through that. And somewhere in that, well, maybe before that, I had been introduced to EMDR, and I was a skeptic, like a lot of people are, because it's a weird modality and it's different than what we are used to. And I ended up trying it. I fell in love with it. I saw what it could do in my own life. And then I began to integrate and use it with my clients. And I just saw the huge life transformations that people were making. And I became a huge believer in it. And I'm all about, I'm a very goal-oriented, driven person. And so I like results that are quick so that I can get on to the next thing, because I have a lot I want to do in life. And so with EMDR, one of the things that we would kind of see is like clients would come into treatment and they were being here forever. Some of them, it would take years to make progress. And EMDR was great to me because we saw success and saw results fast. And people got to where they could heal and move past through a lot of these barriers that they had faced. And then they could move on to achieving new things in their life. So I loved it. And after I had successfully owned and operated that practice for about 7 years, I sold that to another big mental health agency. And now I just do trainings, and I'm passionate about educating other professionals in the US and internationally on how we can help people make more progress and overcome those barriers in their life. There's my mouthful of where I came from.
I love it. And, it's fascinating because many of us are very goal oriented, high achieving individuals.
Mhm.
And yet, some of us don't really understand why we sometimes fail to achieve our objectives. And we might think to ourselves, okay, I'm not good enough, I'm not whatever experienced enough. Or we might be just really judgmental, really
Yeah.
kind of negative talk, self-talk
Mhm.
kind of place. And so it's really interesting that you're kind of bringing to us now that there might be something like, for example, traumas that
Mhm.
we've experienced that we might not even consciously remember that might be impacting our performance today and our ability to go to even higher levels in the future. So, would you be willing to share a little bit about what trauma is, maybe also, of course, what EMDR is?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's funny that you brought that up, because I think for myself and a lot of people that I've worked with, when we hear the word trauma, there's some of us, right, that are like, oh, I don't have trauma, I'm fine. And I grew up that way very much, where I was like, I don't have trauma. I'm a successful, hardworking person. Like, I was just raised right. And these were things that I had to go through. And so it took me a lot of understanding and having the definition broadened for me to really understand what trauma is and why it was important, and to not have shame around it. So I would imagine a lot of you that are listening can probably relate to that. But when I think of trauma per se, trauma to me, and I want to be careful here, because I think as a society we've gotten highly sensitive, right, about everything can be traumatic, and in some circumstances that might be true. So to me, trauma is anything that negatively impacts the way you see yourself, and anything that negatively impacts the way that you view and interact with others, and anything that negatively impacts your viewpoint of the world around you. So I don't want us to be hypersensitive to trauma, or think that everything is traumatizing. I don't want to see us be victims. My goal is to get us from moving from being victims to victors, where we recognize what those barriers are, and then we move through it. We recognize how it's impacting us and how it's getting in the way, and then we get to the other side of it. So when I share that definition, because I've had people ask, so like everything can be traumatic. Well, sure, it can be. And I'm more interested in how we're going to move through it versus oversensitizing us to being really sensitive and mindful to trauma.
I too see that. There's almost like either like everything is trauma, or like
Mhm.
they said, like I've never had trauma. And and sometimes it just takes a situation like an overreaction to something
Yeah.
that we're like, wait a second, where did that come from? Right? The
Mhm.
response didn't quite equal the stimulus, right? So maybe
Yes.
there's some baggage here, something for me to look at. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think if we can use that definition as a way to relate to each other rather than to separate, because we've all experienced trauma and it's different for all of us. But if we could just recognize that we've all been through really hard, heavy things that have greatly impacted us, we'd make a lot more progress than kind of trying to separate out if we've had trauma or if we haven't. So EMDR is really cool. And I actually love it even from a bigger scope than just trauma, because EMDR has the ability to really work with just the core perceptions that we have about ourselves. To me, EMDR is really about the scope or the lens that we see ourselves through, but also that scope and lens that we see others in the world through. So EMDR, the goal is to get those pieces that have been unstuck, those barriers in our life that are causing mishaps for us. It's to get those desensitized, so to speak, and move those out of the way so that we can resume functioning, so that our brain can get back to operating the way that it was intended to, and that we can see ourselves in the world in a more positive light. So that's one of the things that I really like about it, is it's one of the most efficient and effective tools that I've ever used therapeutically, that really will like shake up and take your self-esteem out of the dumps to new levels. So it's really powerful in that regard.
Thank you. And what does EMDR stand for?
Yeah, so the name, it's interesting. This is where people get hung up, right? So EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which sounds like a lot to, anyone that's not in the therapeutic world. So we call it EMDR for short. And we hear the eye movements and people kind of get caught up on that. But to summarize what it really is, and I think the name would be different today because this was initially a theory and a model that started in the late 80s. And so the name kind of dates it as well a little bit, but there's been a lot of really great research and evidence that's supported just how efficient and how effective it is. But to summarize what EMDR is it's essentially looking at getting our brain back to its natural processing abilities. So each of us has a natural way that's unique for all of us of how we process, interpret things, and how we make progress in life and how we cope with things. And so the goal of EMDR, even though it was initially formed from those eye movements, which dates back to REM cycle that we probably won't get a lot into, is that it's just the brain's ability to filter through what it needs to keep and what's useful and get things that are stuck or causing issues out of the way so that we can get back to this natural process of functioning that leads us to functioning the most optimal way possible for us.
I'm sure for a lot of people listening now, they're like, yeah, that sounds really great because I've got some behaviors I'd really rather let go of. I've got
Yes.
some emotional things that I'd really rather not, feel, or maybe thoughts I'd rather not think anymore, beliefs I'd rather not believe anymore. And that's what actually this podcast is all about. It's about kind of this realization that our inner world creates our outer world, and our beliefs, if you will, our intentions. So it's really cool that EMDR can help us to shift those things that are not really serving us anymore. These kind of maladaptive kind of
Yes.
things. So how does all of this play into everyday stress? So let's say if someone says, I don't have trauma per se, but I do feel heavy stress or heavy anxiety or overwhelm. Can EMDR help with that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. A lot of what I use it for is a lot of stress and anxiety. And I really like it for like addiction or like even some impulse control. But one of the ways that we use EMDR is looking at future scenarios and circumstances and allowing ourselves the space and the time for how we want to work through those things. But in the realm of stress, I think it's important for us to understand the way that stress impacts the brain. So I'm sure for a lot of you that are listening, you're like, this all sounds great, right? We've been hand fed and shoveled so many different techniques and tools that will work. And if we just do this one thing, that it really will help. But it's important for you to, as you learn and find what's going to work for you, you need to understand the way that your brain operates, because this will tell you a lot about when you try certain maybe coping skills or grounding techniques or whatever it is. If there's things that don't work, sometimes we get frustrated and it can lead us to a sense of defeat. So it's important for you to understand why that happens. And so one of the analogies that I like to use for this is understanding how stress impacts our brain and our body is to understand what happens with the brain. And so I kind of have a simplistic way of kind of explaining this. And I think of the brain like a stoplight. And this is a really easy way for you to all kind of just think about and conceptualize the way that your brain works and the way that it functions on a day-to-day basis. So much like a stoplight, our brain kind of operates very similar. So in this front region, which we'll call the green light of our brain is the front part of our brain that sits it right and behind our forehead. And this is where we make concrete decisions. This is where we can use logic and we can rationalize through things. We can problem solve. This is where all this good kind of left and brain thinking happens. This is where everything's operating the way that it's intended to. So much like a green light when you're driving down the road and we see green light after green light, what we know is that everything's good to go. So we're just driving and operating smoothly, right? We're just going down the road. Everything's as is. We're not on high alert. We just know what to do. It's a natural process that's happening. Well, a yellow light comes on, let's say, just like we're driving, and we have this yellow light region of the brain. And we know that if we're driving, when we see a yellow light, what happens is we start to take in our surroundings. So all of a sudden we start to check the intersections, we're checking our rear view mirror, we're kind of scanning and surveying our surroundings for any potential threat or danger, right? Making sure the car behind us is going to see that we're going to have to stop, making sure no one's going to cross those intersections and hit us. And it's to alert us if there is any danger. Well, our brain has kind of the same kind of cautionary process as well. And this is kind of in our midbrain, which I call Amy for short because it's easy for me to remember this part of the brain. And Amy is just short for the amygdala. But this yellow light region of our brain, or Amy, like I call her job is very similar to what happens when we're driving and we see that yellow light. She starts to survey our surroundings and she's taking in everything that she can and seeing what she needs to be aware of and the possibility that she needs to react. So if she notices maybe that there's a car coming through the intersection and we're at this yellow blinking light, she knows to stop. So she helps us very quickly and habitually react the way that we're intended to. So when Amy senses danger, this yellow light region, it leads to this red light, or this red portion of our brain, which is where this fight, flight, or freeze response is. So much like a stoplight, if you think about a stoplight, when that red light goes on, our only option is to stop and freeze, right? We can't move forward. We're just kind of stuck. And the brain operates the same way. So once Amy has sensed danger and we get sent into the back brain, our only options are fight, flight, and freeze. Those are the only functions that part of the brain is responsible for. Now, here's what's important about all this for those of you that are listening, is much like a stoplight, a green and a red light cannot be on at the same time. So it's either a green light or a red light. And we know this as we're driving, right? So if I'm in, let's say I've been flooded with stress, and I'm feeling like I'm going to either like miss out on an opportunity or I'm triggered by something someone said, I might go into this red light state where I'm in this like anxious fight, flight, or freeze kind of response. When that happens, that front part of the brain, that green light region, that part of the brain, if we look at brain scans, there's actually very limited to low activity that's occurring. So our ability to problem solve, our ability to make concrete decisions, our ability to use logic, that part of the brain is shut down and we're unable to access that. So this is where I see a lot of people that get frustrated because they're like, I knew better and I don't know why I responded this way, or I lost my temper and I don't understand why I couldn't control it. There's a real like biopsychosocial thing that's taking place where your brain is literally biologically shutting down to prepare you to respond for whatever the perceived threat is. No matter how real or imagined the threat is, your brain interprets it the same way. So it's important to understand that sometimes those like cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, right? Like take 5 deep breaths, or, list out 3 things we're grateful for. Those things work wonderfully if we're in that front part of the brain, if the green light region of the brain is on. They don't work wonderfully when we're triggered and we start to shut down because we can't access the ability to say, okay, I need to use these coping skills now.
Thank you for taking us through that.
Yes.
I just absolutely love that metaphor. And, just today, one of my clients, he's a newer client. We just had a couple of sessions together and kind of training him on some self-regulation tools. We're doing some resilience work. And he said to me today, this week I had a meeting on this volunteer committee that I oversee. He's a CEO of an organization, and he oversees some, I imagine, nonprofits. And he said, and somebody said something, and I just like blew, like I just like was so angry, and I don't even know why. It was like there was no real reason for it, but I just lost it. And he's not an angry person, right? Keeps his cool. He is a former professional athlete, but he just lost it. And so, your example of the spotlight is perfect for that, right? So there might have been some stress that was going on, and then right? Just
Yeah.
wasn't able to use, the few tools that he's learned so far in that moment. He had not yet built enough resilience capacity in his body.
And it's interesting you say that about stress, because one thing that's important to know too is that the brain interprets stress very similar to trauma, because when we're in a trauma, whether it's trauma or stress, the brain starts to release cortisol and adrenaline, the stress hormones, and then it floods us with adrenaline, right? And so if someone's already in a high state of stress, like they're flooded with demands, they're overwhelmed with everything that's going on, because our brain can only take in so much information in a given day, that our system is being flooded with that cortisol, right? And so whether it's trauma or not, your brain can still shut down to extreme amounts of stress, just the way that it would when a trauma comes up.
Thank you. So if a client that has a lot of stress is coming to your practice, so you're going to do some work with them, what would an EMDR session look like? What do you do together?
Yeah. So a lot of the times we start by identifying, I like to look at the negative core beliefs that are getting in the way. So I like to identify the negative perceptions that they have. So those internal beliefs they're holding about themselves. So it could be like, I'm never going to get past this, or I continue to fail, whatever those negative beliefs are. That's what I'm going to be targeting to work through. I also look at doing like a history of a timeline of events that have occurred in their life, whether they be traumatic or not, look at current day stressors. But then I also do something a little bit different as well, as I look at a resiliency timeline. Resiliency is huge for me. I want to look at opportunities that they've had throughout their life, especially during the worst or the most difficult times in their life, what kept them going and what got them motivated. And so usually if I can tap into those and we can integrate them into our work with EMDR, we make a lot of progress. But once we get into the actual EMDR processing, we're looking at kind of getting those parts unstuck. So we use what we call bilateral stimulation, which stimulates the right and left side of our central nervous system. And all this does is it gets our brain to communicate with itself from right to left. And when there's nice communication and there's stimulation from the right and left side of our brain and body, it forces that frontal lobe to come back online so that you can make concrete, rational decisions. And so we not only identify those beliefs, but then we're going to add kind of that bilateral stimulation as we process things, maybe those traumas or stressors or whatever. And we're going to try to get those parts unstuck through the brain's natural healing process. So I tell people EMDR is a lot like, it's like a free association experience. For a lot of people, it feels kind of like mindfulness practice or guided meditation. A lot of the skills that I teach, that I have clients use in and outside of sessions, feel kind of like a guided meditation, but that they're leading with themselves.
Would you be willing to share any of those with us today that might help for listeners who might be experiencing stress and want a little bit more grounding in their life?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, if you guys are anything like me, because I am a very ADHD person, and so mindfulness and meditation have always been something that's been hard for me. Like I can start to listen to something and then I like tune out, and it's like the struggle is real. And so I will tell you that the bilateral stimulation, which I'll explain here in a minute, it actually allows me the ability to stay present while I'm doing like a meditation or grounding. And it's something that I'll add even when I'm doing my own mindfulness practice, because that dual awareness, what we call it, it's forcing me to stay in the here and now. It's forcing me to be present while I'm listening to this instead of trailing off into whatever thought I have going on. It can really help you just learn to get grounded in the moment. So there's a couple different options for that. So if you're listening, and I know a lot of us, as we listen to podcasts, you might not have the opportunity to do this because you're driving, or you're somewhere where you won't be able to practice this. And I'll talk about some modifications that you can use with this. And then if you listen to it later, I would encourage you to try some of these other forms of bilateral stimulation. So the most common form of bilateral stimulation that I teach my clients when they're doing things alone or practicing these skills is what we call the butterfly hug. And you do this just like you cross your arms across your chest, like you're giving yourself a hug, for those of you that are listening. And then you're just going to tap your hands from right to left. So you don't want them tapping at the same time. You just are kind of rotating from one side to the other, and they can just be slow, firm taps. If you're driving, I'm also okay if you just tap the steering wheel from right to left as you drive. That's totally okay too. All we're doing is just trying to get our nervous system alert and awake. So I'm going to walk you through this exercise that I actually created. It's called the path. It's one of my very favorite exercises that I do with clients. It's really good at helping you see how far you've come so far in your life. I use this a lot when people get flooded with stress or they're feeling kind of like hopeless or it feels daunting, to kind of remind them and get their bearings back of how far they've come, but then also how close they are to actually accomplishing their goals or where they want to get. It's super powerful. So I'll walk you through this. You can just listen if you don't have the opportunity to practice. And maybe I hope that you will try it if you do get to a place later where you can practice this exercise. So the weird thing about all of our EMDR exercises is that you're going to do that bilateral stimulation. So if you're listening and you're giving yourself that butterfly hug, so it's just like you're giving yourself a hug and you're just tapping your hands from right to left on your arms. You're going to do this throughout the entirety of the exercise. So I'll prompt you when I want you to start the taps. I call them tapping. And that just means from right to left. You can also just tap on your knees from right to left or your fingers from right to left, whatever's comfortable. It's also okay if you can't do that and you just want to listen and you do fine with mindfulness. So I will prompt you and I want you to start the tapping, and then you're going to do it through the entirety of while I'm talking. It will feel kind of like a guided meditation. I'll prompt you and I want you to stop the tapping, and then we'll go from there. I'll give you directives on what we're looking for. So I'd like invite everyone to just take a big deep breath in with me. Go ahead and let that go. And you can have eyes closed or open. It's up to you. Most people prefer eyes closed. Go ahead and start that bilateral stimulation from me. So if you're doing that butterfly hug, cross your arms across your chest, and you're just going to be tapping from right to left. And you're going to continue that as I kind of walk us through this first part. So I want you to start with envisioning or imagining a path or a trail. And it can be any path or any trail, somewhere you've been or haven't been. I want you to just notice standing at the head or the base of this trail or path. Go ahead and take a minute and just kind of notice the surroundings. So notice the colors, the objects. Notice the environment that you would be in. Notice the time of day. If there'd be a particular smell or scent to the place. Notice everything that you can hear in this place. And then notice the way that it physically feels. Is there a breeze? Is it warm? Is it cool? What you'd be wearing. And as you stand at the base of this path, I just want you to look ahead or imagine looking ahead down the path. Where does this trail or path lead? And it's okay if you don't know. And what obstacles might you run into? Are there any barriers, parts that will be difficult that you can imagine or envision on this journey? And then notice what kind of gear or items you might need that's going to help make this journey possible. You can even notice if anyone would be there with you. Sometimes we need people to make the journey with us or that trek. And then as you think about kind of this journey or this trail and all that you might encounter, I want you to think about where this trail or path leads. So what lies at the end? How will you know when you've arrived? How long do you anticipate that it would take to get to the end of this path? And then what's waiting there for you? You can again take in that scenery for a minute and envision everything you might find, feel, or sense as you arrive at that final destination. And go ahead and stop those taps for me and take a deep breath in with me. We'll let that go. And we'll take a minute and just think about for yourselves, those of you that are listening, just notice kind of what came up for you. What did you notice? What was there? What did you envision? And Brad, I'm curious if you wouldn't mind sharing for the listeners, what did you envision as you brought up your path?
Oh, this is an amazing experience. Thank you, Megan. So
Mhm.
at the end, very end of it was the ocean, specifically Maui,
I
and a
love
beautiful
it.
beach. And there were lots of flowers. I was on purpose by myself. You know, there were ups and downs and all kinds of obstacles. I had all kinds of things on, you know, of course, like water and snacks, that kind of thing. Nice pillow if I wanted to rest along the path. But I could see very clearly what the end point was. As you said, kind of like, how will I know that I got there? I know very clearly. How will I know? I know exactly what I'd be doing. Um, and it's very, very empowering and very, it's very clear to me. And that feels really good.
Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing with us. And we're going to go back into the second part of this activity, and I'm excited to see how um, this changes for you or what you notice. And I like that the listeners are getting an example to know what comes up. And if you are practicing this, I want you to know that this is the cool thing with EMDR is that there is not a right or a wrong way to do this. So whatever comes up for you, whatever you imagine, it has meaning and purpose for you, even if it feels completely unrelated. It's an opportunity to tune in inside and see where barriers are, or even just how amazing and creative our own individual process is. So we're going to go back into the last part of this activity. So I'm going to invite you guys all again to take a deep breath in with me. We'll let that go. And you can have your eyes closed or open, and then go ahead and start those taps again. And again, remember, we're just rotating, tapping from the right to the left. And we're going to continue with that again through the entirety of the second portion of the exercise. So bring yourself back to that path or trail that you envisioned. Take a moment again, notice the base of the trail. Scan the surroundings. You can see the colors, the environment, the objects. Notice everything you can hear. Notice the way that you feel physically and emotionally, especially as you look ahead down the path. And again, just notice how long the path or trail feels to you. And then just take a moment and notice where the path leads. What's the final destination? How do you know that you've arrived? But now, as you think about the path, I want you to think about it as your own journey of life. So notice where you started, what the beginning of that path felt like for you. Notice everything that you've had to overcome, the obstacles, those difficult points that maybe you thought you wouldn't get past or couldn't even see around. Notice the resources, whether it be supplies or people or your own inner strength that helped you continue to push through. And then look ahead at where you're wanting to get. How will you know when you've arrived at where you want to be in your life as a person? The things that you want to accomplish. maybe even the legacy that you want to leave. And as you look at this path and you consider the path of your own life, I want you to notice where you're at on that path today. Take a moment and notice, if you can imagine, looking back at how far you've come. And then notice how close you are to the end. It might be farther away than what you want it to be right now. That's okay. But just notice you're closer than where you started. And what's it going to help take you to reaching this final destination? It's going to help give you that final push to make that final descent. You can see yourself getting past some of those last hurdles. And take a moment and just see yourself arriving at the end. What will that feel like? What will you find there? What's been waiting all along for you? Go ahead and take another deep breath in for me. You can stop those taps and let that breath go. And would you be okay to share with us what changed? I actually loved, I have to tell you, the first time when you said the end of my path is the ocean. I love this because I'm all about like imagery and I'm like, oh, I love it. It's like vast opportunity. So tell me, sometimes it changes. So tell me what came up this time.
Yeah, really powerful, Megan. Thank you. When you had me turn around and kind of look back and also kind of like where I started, that was huge because I think I'm
Mhm.
so focused on like looking at where I want to be, and sometimes it feels so far away.
Yes.
Like I know I can do it, and it also feels still like there's a lot between here and there. But when
Yes.
I looked back, it was like, wow. Um,
Yeah. Most of us don't even realize how far we've come, right? Like we forget, we lose our perspective of just how far we've actually already traveled. And it's important for us to take the time to do that. That's what I love about this too. So, okay, tell me then what changed for you as you turned and looked ahead.
a lot. So it all of a sudden didn't seem so far away when you kind of said like, because I kind of looked back, all of a sudden I kind of realized, you know what, I could kind of be there tomorrow if I really wanted to. Um, so it's like in a way, I've already arrived in the sense of already feeling all the things I want to feel in the future. Like I feel them now for the most part.
Yeah.
And so that was a cool realization. And, because when I first did this, I was thinking of that like as kind of like retirement, end of life. But then it
Mhm.
was like, wait a second, no. Like I could be a lot faster. It could be in 2 years, right? And then I have the whole rest of my life to enjoy it and other things. So it kind of like shifted the whole perspective of the path and the what is arrival
Mhm.
for me. Now, right now, what I'm walking away with, first of all, is a huge acknowledgement to that, I don't know if to call it spirit inside of me or whatever that
Yeah.
is, that was resilient through
Mhm.
all those years, and that it believes in I believe in my ability to get to where I want to go. And it's like, okay, now I can have even more fun
Yeah.
in the kind of remaining parts of my journey.
Yeah. It really shifts. I like the way that this one shifts, like our perspective of moving forward. Cause like you said, sometimes we get bogged down with like, oh my gosh, I still have so much to do before I get there. It almost reshapes or moves those things that were stuck, like we were talking about, and it helps us get into perspective what really matters, right? The little unimportant things kind of fall away, and it really gets you honed back in on where your thoughts need to be to move forward. I hope you guys enjoyed this one and use this as you need to when you start to get off kilter and just need to get rehoned in to what your goal, your vision, or your purpose is.
Thank you. And the kind of bilateral stimulation, is that something that people can do just throughout the day if they find themselves kind of a little overwhelmed or stressed out? Would that be helpful to them in some way?
Yeah, I like it for the grounding. You can do it, less is more with it. So you can, just like anything, we can get desensitized. So if you think about even just tapping for a few minutes, like for a few seconds, rather, like 30, 15 to 30 seconds, sometimes it can just kind of get your nervous system to calm down a little bit. So that's also a great additive that you can use that's quite nice and doesn't require a lot of thought, right?
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Megan, for everything that you've shared with us today,
Yeah.
helping us to understand our brain, have a little more forgiveness with ourselves if we don't remember to use the tool or, the
Yeah.
thing we heard on the podcast necessarily or the book or whatever, and to just have more compassion and curiosity. And I'm curious, how can people learn more about you, your trainings, more about
Yeah.
EMDR?
Yeah, I'm always happy to connect and to share any resources or knowledge that you might have at various levels for anyone listening. So you can find me on thementalsurvivalist.com is my website. I'm also on LinkedIn under Megan McQuary. And I speak quite regularly with PESI, which is PESI. It's one of the largest mental health continuing education providers, but start first at my website. There's some good resources there, and that's thementalsurvivalist.com. There's some links to learning further about EMDR as well, but I recommend EMDR if you guys haven't tried it yet.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you once
Yes.
again, Megan, from all my heart. And I hope everyone, explores EMDR, considers having an experience of that themselves to see how it could help them. And of course, to check out the trainings if that's something that fits their desires. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you for everyone that was tuning in and listening today as well.